please continue enjoying your lunch. Philippe and I will get started. It's great to have you all here, and it's great to have you here, Philippe.
Well, thank you, Carol. It's a pleasure. I know it's taken a while for us to make this happen.
But we've been talking about it in all the most glamorous places, though.
That's
so
true. That's
you know,
true.
except on the ocean. This is one I would have liked to have booked, you know, on a Bahamian
on location.
beach.
Yes.
But then we can still we can talk about that later when there's not cameras rolling. I'm blushing. That's okay. I hope you don't mind that I promoted this lunch with sex in the headline of the email. You'll forget. But you yourself, I found it in my research somewhere. You said that being environmentally correct or green can also be sexy. So
Well, absolutely. I mean, we certainly look at how do we, you know, do programming or create educational opportunities,
right.
and you know, in all our work that is fun and sexy and exciting, and kind of tries to debunk the myth that it's, you know, a stodgy kind of boring,
right. It's a way of
pedantic
life.
thing. It's really a lifestyle that can be very comfortable and exciting.
But before we get into that, I want to start somewhere. I don't know if this is where every interview you do starts, but I think I understand it. But it's the thing I get asked about the most by people, and that is sort of laying out your family story. And I think that we all pretty much understand Jacques Cousteau is your grandfather. And your father's his son and had one brother, Jean-Michel. Mm-hmm. Can you take us from there?
Well, you know, there's not many of us actually in the world with the name Cousteau. There's only about.
But it seems.
I'm looking for a little help at the back there, maybe 9 or 10 of them. My mother's here.
Well, welcome.
This
welcome.
afternoon.
That's
so,
great. Yeah, that's
she lives here in Washington D.C.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So the creator, as she likes to,
yes,
to
the creator.
refer to herself as. So I'm looking for a little help. I think it's 9 or 10 of us with the name in the world. So there's not actually that many of us. But my
But when you get to court, it seems like there are a whole lot more.
It
but
does.
We'll
true.
get
It's
to
true.
that, though.
You know, my grandfather had 2 children by his first wife. My father, Simone. Yes, my grandmother. Mm-hmm. He had Philippe, my father, and he was the youngest, and then Jean-Michel, my uncle. Mm-hmm. And Jean-Michel had 2 children, or has 2 children, Fabien and Celine, my cousins, and then my father had 2 children, Alexandra and myself.
Right.
So that was the initial kind of family tree. My grandfather had a brother who also had a son, and then who had 2 daughters. So the name is.
Was the brother in the family business?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't really involved in.
It's interesting too. You make a point of saying about your grandfather that he was not an oceanographer.
He was not formally, no.
But you say that very pointedly because that's everybody calls him that.
Well, I mean, in a way, certainly through experience, he was an excellent marine biologist. He was a man of the sea, and I think knew much more about oceanography than many people with degrees and years of experience. But he was not formally trained as an oceanographer or as a marine biologist. Many people assumed that, and he wasn't. He was actually in the Navy in France. He was a commander in the French Navy.
That counts.
And he was not. He was really a communicator.
And a cinematographer.
He was a filmmaker. He was a Renaissance man. He was a writer, a communicator, a filmmaker, an explorer, a poet, so many things. And actually his first passion was to fly. He wanted to join the French Air Force. And it was a car accident that damaged some vertebrae in his back.
Wow.
And eliminated him from being in the running for the French Air Force. And so he turned to the Navy. And a fortuitous event in history, accident in history, that I think we've all benefited from.
Yeah, well, it's sort of a sweet irony, I suppose. His love of flying. I wonder if he instilled that in your father.
Absolutely, I don't know if he instilled it, if it carried on.
Which then, of course, was the cause of your father's death.
And it was, a terrible irony there, a twist of fate again, is that my father was able to realize that passion. He loved flying. And could fly anything.
Yeah.
Helicopters, hot air balloons, hand gliders, airplanes, amphibian airplanes, you name it. And it was indeed, though, the thing through a tragic accident that killed him.
Now, your father, was he an oceanographer?
No, he wasn't trained as an oceanographer or as a formal scientist either. He was also a filmmaker and a writer and a communicator,
right,
and an educator, but not formally a scientist, no.
And so your father went to work for your grandfather, pretty much. They became a team. Did Jean-Michel also go to work?
You know, my father originally was working with my grandfather. My uncle was pursuing other interests. When my father passed away in 1979, that is the point at which my uncle became involved.
And you weren't born.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't born yet.
You were a bump.
I was a little bump, a very little bump. Which grew to be a pretty big bump, 10 pounds, 7 ounces, I think.
Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah.
I'm sure she remembers exactly.
Yes, she was, and because I was 2 weeks late, and so it's kind of a trend that's carried on. Unfortunately, I know I was a little late too. My father died about 6 months before I was born.
Where was that? Where did the accident happen?
He was flying the seaplane, the PBY, the
that
flying
he loved.
Calypso that he loved. It was his base, his love.
Right.
I think second love, though.
Right.
Of course.
Yes.
And it was the base from which they filmed many of the expeditions. Now, originally, they were contracted to do 4 episodes of the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau per year. Now, the Calypso is an old World War II minesweeper, wooden-hulled minesweeper.
Right.
So it was very slow. And it was very difficult for them to be able to do all 4 films and get the Calypso everywhere they needed to go to do 4 separate episodes per year. So my father bought the PBY plane that they could split, and he could be filming episodes from that as the base, and then Calypso could be doing other things.
It's interesting too that you're. Oh, goodness, excuse me. It's interesting too that your grandfather didn't own the Calypso. It was loaned to him by a very rich man. Was it Guinness?
Yes,
or
Lowell
leased
Guinness.
To him?
It was. It was kind of leased to him, ceremonial lease of I think it was
clever.
a franc a year. From the Guinness family, but way back it split off from the Guinness family originated with beer, split off.
Do you know why they
financial
even
arm
bought
and
it?
beer. You know, my grandfather met Lowell Guinness and I think enchanted him with his work. And Lowell knew that they discussed the fact that my grandfather needed a vessel from which he could do his work.
Yeah, well, that's...
And Lowell, just agreed to purchase the vessel and finance it on a few conditions.
Well, it had to be an enormous burden lifted to not own the boat.
Well, the problem is they still had to maintain it, and they still had to, fuel it, and that, was a big problem, and it was very costly, and was always, I think, the bear that they had to kind of deal with, the financial bear of the Cousteau Society. Now,
there was a side to your grandfather's life that people probably weren't aware of. Obviously, they weren't aware of, but your grandmother died after your father died.
Yeah, Simone died in 1990. So.
And then it turned out that Jacques had a mistress, a long-term mistress.
Yes.
She'd been a flight attendant on Concorde, I guess he met, and
apparently, yes, she was a flight attendant for Air France.
Right.
And
they had a child.
2 actually.
But one while your grandmother was still alive.
Both while my grandmother.
This will be a mini-series.
It's a little. I admit it's a little sordid, but it's nothing that isn't in the papers and is whatever. Anyway.
Right.
So, it was. He had 2 children. One, Diane, the oldest by Francine, who was just a little bit younger than me, and then Pierre-Yves, who was 2 or 3 years younger than me.
But interestingly, he married her not long after your grandmother died, and
a year, I think, a year or 2, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
but
so not long.
a respectable amount of time. But I'm getting to something here. When he died, she was his sole heir. Correct?
Well, she was the executor of the estate, but his heirs would, when she's no longer the executor of the estate, is his 4 children.
My point is, explain why you're not allowed to use your name.
Well, it's more complicated than that. I mean, when we, I guess you're alluding to, we did have some difficulties with her.
Yes.
When my grandfather passed away. And
they're perplexing.
They are perplexing still to us.
Well.